The Knights Templars stand in a dimly lit chamber, not praying, but counting. Gold coins cascade through their fingers as they meticulously record loans in ledgers, not donations to the Holy Land. Outside, armed guards block desperate peasants begging for mercy on overdue debts. A knight whispers to his commander, "The king cannot repay his loan. What shall we do?" The commander's face hardens in the torchlight. "Then we shall own the king." The Templars weren't holy warriors devoted to God. They were medieval bankers who invented offshore finance, evaded taxes through religious exemptions, and built the first multinational financial empire, all while publicly presenting themselves as Christ's humble soldiers. In their secret chapter houses, they didn't plan crusades. They planned economic domination. The opening scene is meant to shock. It hangs in the air like smoke from a torch, violent, metallic, intimate, and it is the one image you almost never saw in school. You were taught instead that the Templars were simple, pious knights protecting pilgrims and dying for the cross. Now, before we unwind that comforting story, let us remember the version most of us learned, the tidy, heroic narrative that fits into a history textbook and a tourist leaflet. In 1119, so the story goes, 9 noble French knights gathered in Jerusalem and swore to protect pilgrims. They lived austere lives, wearing white mantles with red crosses, sleeping on the cold stone, and swearing vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon because they set up camp near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, then believed to rest on the ruins of Solomon's temple. This is the image carved into statues, painted in medieval frescoes, and repeated by historians who favor a neat origin myth. Small, holy beginnings, rapid growth through bravery, tragic and unjust suppression centuries later. Textbooks compress the complexity into a dozen reassuring sentences. Bernard of Clairvaux, we are told, pronounced their cause holy. The Council of Troyes recognized them, and the Church blessed their mission. They fought in the great battles of the Crusades, built towering castles across the Levant, and held firm in the face of Muslim armies. Their end on Friday the 13th of October, 1307 arrives as a moral outrage. Philip IV of France, hungry for money, arrests the order on trumped-up charges. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, is burned at the stake. He cries his innocence. The public shudders. The Templars are turned into saints in popular memory, martyrs betrayed by an avaricious king. This version is cinematic and satisfying. It fits into a moral plot, innocence framed, injustice revealed. It is centerpiece material for movies and novels. You have seen it in films like Kingdom of Heaven, where noble knights ride into battle under a halo of righteousness. You have encountered it in popular games, in sweeping museum exhibits, on postcards sold to thousands of tourists in Tomar and Paris. It comforts because it simplifies. Heroes, villains, betrayal. It erases messiness. Listen to the voices that built this tidy tale. A textbook voice might say, the Templars were called to defend pilgrims and the holy places. A church sermon might intone, they gave their lives so Christian pilgrims might be safe. A documentary narrator will add, in the tone of simple certainty, betrayed by King Philip, the order met a tragic end. These are phrases shaped to reassure. They wipe fingerprints off the history and hand you a polished medal. Who benefits from such a smooth story? Empires gain a moral ancestor. Churches gain a martyr-rich lineage. Nations gain a heroic past to teach in schools. An entertainment industry gains a brand: white mantles, crosses, mystery. Tourism industries profit when you want to see the supposed Templar legacy in stone and banner. The neatness protects power by keeping inconvenient paperwork and financial ledgers out of the spotlight. But if you look closer, if you leaf through the manuscripts, if you sit in the dim reading rooms of archives, the neatness frays. The official tale depends on a handful of flattering sources and a lot of silence. There are gaps the story politely ignores. Who put property into the order and why? What their rule really emphasized? Why kings and nobles entrusted them with cash? How exemptions and privileges multiplied? And why Muslim chroniclers describe them in tones that rarely match protector of pilgrims. Those omissions are not accidental footnotes. They start to sketch a different portrait. We will lay this out carefully. First, we will walk the comfortable halls of the myth and show how it was constructed, how language, images, and authority created a story that was easy to teach and hard to dislodge. Then, we will pry at that story's seams, contradictory facts, suspicious silences, convenient endorsements. Each contradiction is a thread. Pull hard enough, and you begin to unravel a fabric stitched for someone else's benefit. You may be wondering, is this just a revisionist rant? Not at all. The documents are where they always have been: charters, papal bulls, account rolls, chronicles. The claim here is not that the Templars were pure vultures, nor that every legend about Crusader heroism is false. Rather, the claim is that the publicly comfortable narrative is incomplete and at moments intentionally curated. The truth, like any good film, has complicated characters, private conversations, and acts that are morally ambiguous. Once you spot the omissions, you will never see white mantles the same way. Now recall the image you began with: the chamber where coins rattle and ledgers are closed behind thick oak. Imagine a clerk's hand dipping a quill into ink as a knight pushes a heavy purse across a table. Imagine a king, once powerful and proud, who leans on that table when his own coffers run thin. Imagine the quiet meeting rooms in which the language to justify tax exemption, donation, and legal autonomy was crafted. These are not mere metaphors. They are the machinery that turned a military brotherhood into a financial powerhouse. The official myth performs a sleight of hand. While songs sang of valor, contracts accumulated land. While preachers praised sacrifice, charters conferred rights, exemption from local taxes, exemption from episcopal courts, and the right to own property collectively. The rule, the written code of the order, reads like a hybrid: monastic piety on the surface, administrative manual beneath. When you read clauses about how to manage houses and revenues, you sense a practical manual for a multinational enterprise, not a manual on how to patrol a pilgrim route. The Council of Troyes, one of the key turning points in the story, seems miraculous in the traditional telling. Bernard of Clairvaux's advocacy is presented as spiritual endorsement, but the miracle is also political and familial. Bernard's influence was immense, and his backing brought privileges that no rookie volunteer band could have expected. That kind of patronage is not random. The correspondence around Troyes, the endorsements, the rapid granting of exemptions, these read like an oligarchic investment in a project that promised not only spiritual return but material advantage. And so the myth is useful. It masks a trajectory in which the order becomes an extraordinary legal entity, a transnational organization with property, money, and military capacity, accountable not primarily to local lords but to the papacy. This legal autonomy is the point. Answering only to Rome created an effective offshore status, one that sheltered capital and allowed the order to operate in multiple jurisdictions with protections ordinary lords and merchants lacked. You saw the heroic version in your childhood. Now, imagine a chapter house lit by candles, but not for prayer. Imagine accounts being balanced, not masses being said. Imagine knights in white mantles whispering in corridors about rights and revenues, about how to press a defaulting borrower. This is the backstage that the textbooks rarely show. We will now move beyond the comfortable script. We will examine scene by scene where the official story bends around inconvenient paperwork, where the record is bluntly different, and where contemporary Muslim sources describe an order less pious than powerful. The next section will list the first cracks, those discrepancies that, when considered together, force the story into a different shape. Before we continue, Thank you for staying with this investigation. Fields, mills, rents, and rights appear in charters granted by nobles who might have expected practical returns, security of title, protection of heirs, spiritual consolation, more than some distant promise of eternal glory. That contrast should make you curious. Who convinced these men to sign? What was being traded? The myth says the order existed to protect pilgrims. Logically, a few knights, 9 or even 50, cannot cover the roads between Antioch and Jerusalem. It is a logistical absurdity dressed up as virtue. The burden of protecting long caravan routes belongs to states and well-funded contingents, not a tiny brotherhood. Contemporary records show almost no systematic evidence that the Templars actually administered road protection during their early years. They were based for a decade at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a compound in Jerusalem rich in symbolism and, as rumor insisted, layered atop relic-laden chambers and, conveniently, near supposed caches of Solomon's wealth. This is not mere speculation. Consider Baldwin II's correspondence. The king of Jerusalem wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux asking for endorsement. Bernard, Europe's greatest ecclesiastical influencer at the time, responded not only with praise but with active promotion. He drafted, in praise of the new knighthood, a text that framed the order as Christ's militant monks. That text was a public relations masterstroke. Yet another inconvenient fact: Bernard was related to Hugh de Payens. Family ties and spiritual endorsement are a potent mixture. Patrons rarely back wholly implausible ventures. They back projects that promise stability and advantage. Why is that relevant? Because patronage accelerates legitimacy, and legitimacy opens doors to property, privileges, and exemptions. Now read the rule of the order. It looks like a monastic rule: rituals, prayers, vows. But it also contains operational sections, detailed instructions about acquiring land, managing estates, dealing with tenants, and handling disputes. These are not peripheral notes. They are parameters for a property-owning enterprise. The rule sets out how to record rents, store grain, and manage harvests. It includes guidance for counting and transferring resources between houses. For an organization allegedly dedicated to keeping pilgrims safe, such attention to property management is striking. It is as if a modern NGO professed humanitarian aims while its statutes read more like a banking code. The fiction that they were primarily protectors of the road begins to collapse the moment we look at accounts. The Templars offered financial services, safekeeping of valuables, letters of credit, transfers across long distances. Imagine a merchant in northern France with sacks of coin who wanted to travel to Acre. He could deposit his money with a Templar preceptory and receive a letter that allowed withdrawal at a Templar house in the Levant. This is not charity. It is financial innovation. The order was the medieval equivalent of cross-border banking. Merchants and nobles liked that. Kings appreciated convenient credit lines. And the order profited quietly from fees, from the lands acquired by default, and from the legal immunities that protected their operations. Muslim chroniclers provide another angle. Usama ibn Munkid, who observed Christian forces close up, describes Templars less as disciplined monastics than as zealots whose conduct could be harsh and self-interested. His descriptions do not align with the guardian angel image. When you stack European hagiography against Arabic observation, they tell different stories. Each voice has bias, yes, but the dissonance itself is informative. If the Templars' purpose were purely holy, one would expect consistent accounts of pilgrims being escorted and rescued. Instead, what emerges are references to aggressive territorial acquisition and behaviors that elicit local animosity. Another conspicuous detail: the order's privileges. Papal bulls and other legal instruments granted the Templars unusual immunities. They were exempt from local taxation. Bishops had limited authority over their houses. They had direct papal protection. Legally, the order was an institution detached from regular feudal obligations. Imagine, for a moment, A company today that registered under favorable laws in one country to escape the tax regimes of another. The comparison is not exact, but the logic is similar. The Templars used ecclesiastical structures to create a jurisdictional shelter. That shelter facilitated capital accumulation without the typical local checks that might hinder a purely secular company. Recruitment strategy confirms the economic logic. The order targeted second sons and wealthy widowers, people with resources but little inheritance prospects. Members often brought property into the order upon entry. That is not asceticism, that is seed capital. New members' donations expanded the order's asset base. It was a deliberate business model dressed in the language of spiritual commitment. The knight who took vows often handed over the very lands that would fund further expansion. The process resembles franchise investments more than vocations. The higher officers lived comfortably. They had retinues, silverware, and undergarments fine enough to surprise anyone picturing uniform rusticity. The disparity between the officers' lifestyle and the order's professed poverty is instructive. Politically, the Templars were astute. They negotiated treaties, sometimes independently of Crusader leadership. They cultivated relationships with Muslim rulers when it suited their interests. They opposed peace when peace humbled their fundraising narrative. Consider the reaction to the relatively peaceful conclusion of some later crusade efforts. The Templars were not enthusiastic. Why? When negotiation brought Jerusalem back under Christian control without massive military expenditure, it undermined the perpetual crisis that funded the order. Crisis feeds donation, donation fuels networks, networks compound into influence. The order had real stakes in a narrative of constant need. If you are tracking patterns, you have reached an unsettling conclusion. The order engineered moral narratives that supported an economic infrastructure. They fought when it enhanced their brand. They shied away when fighting would endanger their capital. They struck bargains that preserved income streams. This is not to say every fight was staged only for profit. There were sincere believers among them, but strategic economic calculus informed many institutional decisions. Now imagine the human cost. Fields foreclosed by Templar administrators, tenants evicted, local jurisdictions stripped of authority, rival merchants undercut by a competitor that paid no taxes. These are the likely outcomes when privileged institutions accumulate property with military backing. The picture becomes less romantic. It becomes familiar. An organization with arms and law-exempt status can be as dangerous as any predatory corporation if its incentives are misaligned with local welfare. These initial cracks, differences in founding accounts, disproportionate property records, an administratively heavy rule, contrasting external chronicles, and privileges that created de facto tax havens do more than complicate a story. They reorient the narrative. The Templars begin to look like a nascent multinational. Centralized administration, standardized procedures, internal audits across preceptories, and a growing portfolio of assets spread across borders. They were an entity whose spiritual rhetoric masked economic function. And yet, in public, the Templars remained powerful storytellers. Their white mantle with a red cross became a brand that guaranteed safety, sanctity, and service. The order controlled the image carefully. They limited what outsiders could see. Chapter meetings were secretive. Records were kept under lock. Only selected narratives left their houses. When accusations later arose, that secrecy made transgression plausible to the public. It was precisely the opacity that allowed Philip IV to seize on allegations in 1307. The same secret that protected them from everyday rivals made them vulnerable to a king who coveted their wealth. One more puzzle. Why did this communication strategy work so well for so long? The answer lies in a medieval ecosystem that trusted ritual, authority, and spectacle. Bernard's treatise had enormous currency. Papal bulls conferred trust. Sermons in local churches repeated the Templars' sanctity. Call it early branding. The order created social proof. powerful endorsements, visual uniformity, and the ritual. Once you replace that image with a more honest portrait, a hybrid of faith, profit, diplomacy, and force, you are left with a story both less tidy and more familiar. It is the story of institutions that grow in influence by mixing public virtue with private advantage. So the first cracks do not merely imply misconduct. They reveal a method. Religious language and legal privilege were instruments for building a supranational financial network. The next question, which we will follow in later sections, is how the Templars manufactured consent, how they controlled information, how they used art and preaching to reinforce brand identity, and how their downfall produced a martyrdom narrative so persuasive that it occluded the ledgers once more. For now, hold this ledger image in your mind. A table strewn with receipts, a candle guttering nearby, a knight in a white mantle counting coins. The scene is intimate and ordinary. It is not a betrayal of faith in every instance, but it is proof that the order's primary engine was often economic. The myth taught you saints, the archives record accountants. That contrast is the first serious fissure in a story most people never question, and once you see it, the myth begins to look like a construction rather than a discovery. What follows will be a deeper pull at those threads. More documents, more scenes, more voices, some defensive, some accusing. Each reveals another corner where the official story bends to accommodate power. And then we will ask the most important question. What does it mean that a medieval corporation used sanctity as a regulatory loophole, and how many modern institutions learn the same lesson? Behind the white mantle, in rooms the public never saw, the order looked less like a cloistered army of novices and more like the central office of a sprawling enterprise. Imagine a preceptory at dusk, a long hall with flagstones polished by boots, a lattice of candles, a heavy wooden table scarred by ledgers. A scribe sits hunched, quill scratching in a cramped hand, parchment curls at the edges. A chest of iron-bound wooden boxes sits open nearby, each compartment labeled in neat shorthand: rents due, tithes received, annuities promised. The smell is a mixture of smoke, damp wool, and old ink. That is the smell of administration, not of incense alone. A commander enters, boots clank, cloak whispers. He does not kneel to pray first. He reads a list. Names of villages, acres missed, a notation seized, per preceptory order. He points, and a retainer takes a ledger to the clerk. There is no sermon. There is a calculation. This is a daily rhythm in many houses: collection, accounting, adjudication. You have been taught to picture them in mail and sword, but the record books insist on different hours. Templar houses kept inventories of grain, wine, wool, and the implements needed to extract rent from land. Their rules devote pages to how to manage barns and mills, how to vet tenants, how to appoint stewards, details that read more like a manual for rural management or a merchant's ledger than an ascetic's diary. Those pages are not marginalia, they are core texts. They are the scaffolding for a network that had to function across dozens, then hundreds, of jurisdictions. Consider the letters of credit. A noble in northern France preparing to travel to the Levant worries about brigands on the road and the risk of carrying coin. The solution he buys is a Templar instrument. Deposit your coin in a European house, receive a sealed letter, travel, and draw the equivalent at an Eastern house. For a fee, of course. The camera lingers on the exchange, leather purse to chests, signatures scratched, a wax seal pressed. The luxury of mobility, the ability to move wealth without hauling chests through mountain passes, was a product the Templars sold, and it turned trust into revenue. There is design to that trust. The order cultivated an appearance of sanctity and reliability, but inside, its trust infrastructure depended on audited ledgers, delegate managers in far-flung houses, and a chain of authority that moved money like troops. Preceptories posted accounts, communicated by messenger and emissary, and established bilateral arrangements with local authorities. When a payment failed, the legal machinery seizure of land, claims in courts where the Templars had privileged status kicked in. That machinery looks remarkably like the apparatus of a firm protecting its capital and enforcing contracts. The human story inside those walls is not uniform. Low-ranking members often lived simply, and some joined convinced of spiritual service. But money attracts hierarchy, and hierarchy creates privilege. The leaders' priors, preceptors, the Grand Master ate with better plates, owned richer garments, and traveled with retinues that implied political weight. Their quarters were furnished in a way that surprised many later chroniclers expecting universal penury. A visitor might notice silverware tucked in a chest, the careful stitch of a commissioned tunic, the presence of servants. Such comforts were justified as necessary for negotiation, representation, and command. But the optics in towns across Europe eroded the rhetoric of poverty. Here, indeed, was an institution answering to its own standards. The recruitment funnel fed this system. Families with a spare son, second-born, without inheritance found the order attractive. A marriageable woman's dowry or a widow's donation often followed. New members brought property into the order's corpus. In effect, each profession was an investment. The order's legal independence from local feudal obligations, its direct relationship with the papacy, meant that land given to the Templars was, in many cases, outside the reach of local feudal duties and taxes. Land given for pious reasons became, through law and practice, a protected asset of a transnational organization. You saw their brand in the public square, the white mantle, the red cross, the pageant of processions, but you rarely saw the contract. Imagine a notary's desk where a knight signs away the little land his family owned. He does this with prayer on his lips and a seal cut into wax. The camera closes in on the wax, a cross pressed into it, and then pans to the title under the order's seal. What did the donor expect? Spiritual security, certainly, but also something practical. The order would care for the land, manage its yields, and perhaps ensure the donor's family had a claim to spiritual benefits. The order grew, therefore, with capital grafted into it. And capital needs protection. That is why the legal privileges are vital. Papal bulls exempted Templar holdings from local jurisdictions and taxes. Bishops could not easily exercise authority over their houses. The order answered directly to Rome. That unique legal personality, an early form of corporate autonomy, was the shelter that allowed accumulation at scale. It was the medieval functional equivalent of registering a business in a tax-advantaged jurisdiction. It was also unprecedented, an organization that combined spiritual mandate with legal insulation. Look at their disputes. When a noble or merchant fell behind on an obligation secured to the order, the Templars pursued remedies. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they foreclosed. Skies of rumor darken when records show fields being surrendered, when disputes over water rights escalate into court cases. Imagine a Templar steward shadowing a tenant, counting harvest yields, taking grain to the storehouse. The low murmur of complaint turns to cries only when a hint of force is visible. Soldiers posted at a manor gate, legal writs pinned to the parish door. For communities that once relied on local lordship with obligations both ways, a new kind of lordship appeared remote, legally armored, and backed by armed men. In the Levant, the dynamic was amplified. Fortresses served not just as defensive positions, but as nodes in a supply network. A castle guarded a road, yes, but it also stored grain, silver, and contracts. The Templars defended convoys not purely out of chivalric zeal, but because maintaining safe transport preserved trust in their financial instruments. A merchant would not deposit coin with an order that could not guarantee retrieval in the East. The military function and the financial function were mutually reinforcing. Politics exploited that mutual reinforcement. Kings and emperors needed credit. The Templars had liquidity, and they offered lines of support, not always freely. Monarchs borrowed, often against future taxes or symbolic pledges. When a king resisted repayment, the Red Cross was both a symbol of faith and a practical trademark. Wherever the mantle appeared, people trusted that contracts could be enforced. Here is the seam worth pulling. Institutions that develop protective legal status and public sanctity, and that can currently build financial instruments and networks, will naturally attract both loyalties and enemies. The order's expansion of privileges built its empire. The same expansion sowed seeds of resentment and created a target for those who coveted its wealth. In private offices, between candles and ledgers, knights made decisions that rippled outward as knights on the field. Those decisions: who to press for debt, which property to accept, what deals to make with monarchs, built an order less monastic than managerial. And for all this, the most dangerous asset was secrecy. Closed chapter meetings, locked accounts, esoteric oaths, all were, in different measures, sound governance for a transnational network. But secrecy also bred suspicion. What the order could hide with its seals, it ultimately could not control. When a powerful king decided it was convenient to stop pretending, the seals meant sanctity. The same opacity that protected their banking network one day made them vulnerable to accusation on the next. If you imagine a long table piled with receipts and seals, imagine too the slow accumulation of stories outside that hall. Complaints, rumors, the quiet calculations of rivals. The curtain trembles. An event looms, a choice, a misfortune, a political squeeze that will test the strength of the order's legal shelter and the resilience of its reputation. The next scene is where all those ledgers, loyalties, and privileges collide. What happens when a king with his own debts decides to act? The answer will reshape the order in ways no chapter meeting could have anticipated. The hill at Crescent is not dramatic in itself, scrub, stone, dust. But on May 1st, 1187, it became a stage for an irreversible decision. The morning air was thin and hot. Men had ridden all night. Tents flapped. There was the low clatter of harness, the creak of saddle leather, the sharp scent of sweat and horses. In that heat, discipline phrased quickly, and temper matters more than doctrine. Gerard de Ridefort, Grand Master of the Templars at the time, stood with a posture history will later ask about. He had enemies, grudges, alliances, and ambitions. The animus he harbored toward Raymond III of Tripoli, old-oaked in courtly promises and personal slights, did not exist in a vacuum. Personal affronts met with institutional power can become catastrophic when the person in charge commands forces trained for violence. What mattered on Crescent was not merely the tactical calculus of horse against spear. It was the mixing of private vendetta with institutional command. Reports tell us that Gerard ignored counsel. The master of the hospital, an allied commander known for prudence, urged caution, recommended retreat when the odds looked bad. But Ridefort, angered and impatient, ordered a charge. The camera should linger on a human detail, a gloved hand unclipping a banner, a mouth set like flint, a retinue moving forward. The result was swift and savage. 40 Templars rode into a force superior in numbers and position. Sound becomes immediate. The shriek of arrows, the thud of lances, a horse's whimper. Few returned. Battles in the medieval Levant often hinge on the decisions of the few. Crescent is a textbook case of how personal motives shape outcomes. Those lost were not merely statistics, they were elite soldiers trained and invested in a cause larger than themselves. Their deaths were both a moral and a material loss. On the human level, families were bereaved. On the institutional level, a trained cohort of fighters vanished from the order's roster. 2 months later, the blow's amplified consequences revealed themselves at Hattin. The Christian army assembled their knights, infantry, militia underestimated the cohesion and strategy of Saladin. The defeat at Hattin was not the consequence of a single error alone, but it was a cascade that began with choices like those at Crescent. The loss of a disciplined corps, the erosion of morale, the fractures among leaders these elements accumulated. The result: Jerusalem fell. Castles surrendered. The dream of an embattled Christian kingdom in the East was shattered. The human cost of those tactical errors is clear in chronicles and letters. The military order that had once seemed an adequate bulwark was exposed as fractious and driven by competing aims. It is here that the Templars' dual nature, military and financial, shows its strain. Military failure deprives the order of its public justification for privileged status. It creates an existential threat to fundraising narratives. If we lose, why keep supporting us? Leaders who had balanced combat with ledger now had to pivot. And the pivot was brutal and revealing. What followed in Europe was not a united martial response, but a fundraising campaign. The loss of Jerusalem and of prestige was converted into an appeal for property, privileges, and donations. In vaulted halls across Christendom, preachers spoke with a familiar cadence. We are the defenders. We need resources to reclaim the holy city. But listen closely. The language shifted from urgent spiritual warfare to institutional survival. Documents circulated granting the order new exemptions and confirming previous ones. Nobles, guilt-ridden or invested in the glow of crusader imagery, donated lands that would never again be plowed for a battlefield but would be administered for income. This is the dark core. A military debacle produces an economic windfall. The order did not merely recover, it grew in relative terms. The narrative offered to the faithful was one of continued holy need. The reality, buried within chapter records and account rolls, was an expansion of the order's financial reach. The Hattene aftermath shows how crisis and narrative combine. Loss becomes instrument for consolidation. Then there is Gerard himself. Captured at Hattene, he did not meet a martyr's death for the cause. He negotiated. Survival, for him, involved decisions that betrayed a promise that knights swore: never surrender Christian territory. To free himself, he contrived the transfer of fortresses, a bargaining that cost other men their posts and lives. That bargain is a bitter knot in the Templar story. A man sworn to defend once used his command to preserve himself. The moral shockwaves were enormous. Oaths, once central to the order's image, now had holes in them. If those events expose individual frailties, they also reveal system-level incentives. When the order's existence depended on perpetual crisis to justify contributions, a prolonged peace posed a financial threat. The story of the later Templars is threaded by this incentive. When the drums of war recede, the narrative of indispensability must be rekindled. That sometimes meant emphasizing threats, sometimes resisting negotiated settlements that might render the order superfluous. The institution had a self-preserving logic: another campaign, another appeal, another influx of property. Look at the human texture after Hattene. In a quiet preceptory in France, a scribe updates a roll of rents with new property. A widow's estate is now marked bequeathed in aid of the Holy War. In Rome, a papal office stamps a bull confirming exemptions. In Acre, a storehouse is built, and there is clinking of coins. Each of these small scenes is a thread that, when woven together, forms a tapestry more financial than chivalric. The Crescent to Hattene sequence also reveals the moral ambiguity of leadership. Men like Rydfort were not purely villainous caricatures. They were human beings whose private affronts and ambitions intersected with institutional roles. The order was filled with sincere believers, but institutional incentives bent those beliefs toward outcomes that benefited the order's continuity. Those outcomes sometimes meant pressing for donations, deploying legal privileges, negotiating treaties that preserved sources of income. The material logic subsumed the idealistic rhetoric. In a broader political perspective, the order's response to defeat reshaped European politics. Wealth gathered in the order's hands flowed back into courts and monasteries, and the shifting of property altered local balances of power. Some lords used Templar connections to bolster their own position. Others saw their influence erode. The redistributed assets were not neutral. They had winners. The aftermath of Crescent exposes that willingness in stark, uncomfortable detail. The next chapter in our story must examine how that willingness was hidden, how the image of holiness was shaped, polished, and sold so that by the time a king reached for their coffers, the public would still see martyrs where ledgers lay. What follows is not a battle, but a campaign of perception. The Templars' greatest defense after Hattin was not a fortification, it was a narrative. How was that narrative manufactured, and who controlled it? The answer will unravel the machinery of belief itself. If you think propaganda is a modern invention, watch how a medieval order did branding. The Templars had a master stroke, combined sanctity with spectacle, law with secrecy, counsel with image. Their arsenal of influence was not limited to swords and seals. It extended to texts, sermons, paintings, and ritual. They were deliberate in shaping what the public saw and, more importantly, what it did not. Begin with words. Bernard of Clairvaux's treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, is a primer in persuasive theology. Read it quickly and you hear a hymn to sanctified violence. Knights who fight for Christ perform a sacred duty akin to monastic labor. Bernard was more than a theologian. He was the influencer of his era. His praise did something crucial. It reframed the identity of a Templar as both monk and soldier, a hybrid that suited donors and rulers alike. Copies of Bernard's panegyric were distributed. His prestige licensed the order's image. It was an early brand endorsement. The Templars understood the mechanics of social proof. Powerful patrons, kings, bishops, nobles lent credibility just by association. Processions, patronage, and public liturgies made those associations visible. The camera should catch a scene of pomp, banners unfurled, a prelate blessing an infirmary, a cortege through a market. For an illiterate population, images matter more than nuance. The white mantle with a red cross was a visual shortcut. Where that mantle appeared, trust followed. Control of information was structural. Chapter meetings were secretive by design. Members swore oaths of silence. This culture of confidentiality had a procedural purpose, discipline, but it also had a reputational one: limit leakage. Documents were stored under seal. Controversies within houses were seldom aired publicly. The controlled narrative victory in battle, piety, charity passed through vetted channels. Dissent and mismanagement were kept behind locked doors. The public saw an icon. The order maintained its accounts in private. They engineered relationships to amplify the message. Place a Templar chaplain in a parish near a property, and the local sermon will sing the order's virtues. Offer associate membership to wealthy lay supporters, and they become a chorus in courts and marketplaces. These associates, though not full brothers, carried the order's story into circles that a monk could not. It is an elegant social architecture, an inner core that commands and an outer ring that spreads testimony. Visual branding mattered too. Commissioned art stained glass, effigies, reliefs portrayed the Templars as paragons. Paintings emphasized the cross, the purity, the holy mission. When towns invested in monuments or a cathedral added a Templar chapel, image met piety head-on. These artifacts endure. They are potent anchors for memory. Later historians, poets, and painters would find a ready-made iconography to adapt and mythologize. Their fundraising methods were also calibrated for urgency. After losses like Hattin, the Templars did not wait for ad hoc offerings. They launched systematized appeals, letters to abbots, sermons coordinated across dioceses, formal requests and synods. When donations lagged, the narrative pivoted subtly. Failure was not their fault. It was proof of a sinful Christendom that needed purification through giving. The psychological pattern is familiar: guilt, urgency, and the promise of redemption through contribution. There was also narrative triage. When things went wrong, the order had scripts ready. Failed missions became tales of martyrdom and betrayal. Tactical errors became tragic necessity. Property acquisitions were reframed as pious bequests. It is a shape-shifting route from accountability to sanctity. When the first accusation against the order later came about secret rites or heretical whispers, the same secrecy that had protected their banking enabled hostile narratives to gain traction. Secrecy that had once been an asset became, in the hands of enemies, evidence of sin. The Templars also played the long media game. Texts circulated, yes, but so did patronage networks and academic endorsements. A monk who taught theology could be given a stipend. A bishop who preached support for the order might receive a bequest. These were not random favors. They were investments in a reputation economy. Influence created influence. The order's rhetorical reach expanded as its material reach did. Culture amplified the myth in ways the Templars could not completely control. Troubadours, chronicles, liturgical reps, and later, romantic poets took the image and polished it into legend. The story White Mantles, Holy Purpose, betrayal by a worldly king has the bones of a tragedy that sells well. Centuries later, that story feeds the tourist brochures and blockbuster scripts. The order had engineered powerful symbols. Others converted them into myth. But propaganda is not just about images and words. It is also about institutional architecture that privileges selective visibility. The order's legal immunities, papal bulls exempting them from local tributes and legal processes, did more than shelter assets. They also shielded the order's narrative from local contestation. A peasant with grievance found few formal avenues. The order's houses were outside the bishop's direct control. The claimants were often powerless against a network that answered to Rome. Silence and invisibility, enforced by law, became narrative tools. That legal shell would be their undoing when the wrong king, deeply indebted and hungry for revenue, chose to expose them. But before Philip IV's reach, the order spent centuries carefully polishing a public image so convincing that even their financial role would take second stage in the popular imagination. When accusations of heresy finally surfaced, the public was primed to believe the spectacle more than the ledgers. Martyrdom fit better into the social imagination than balance sheets. It is important to separate layers here. Some Templars were sincere in their faith. Many performed acts of devotion. Others were motivated by worldly advantages. The propaganda system that kept the order in power did not require universal hypocrisy. It required effective messaging and legal insulation. Sometimes the rhetoric swallowed the reality. Sometimes reality bent the rhetoric to its needs. The result is ambivalence. The Templars were both defenders and entrepreneurs, saints and managers. And so we come to another uncomfortable truth. The Templars were not merely victims when they fell. They were architects of a narrative so persuasive that it survived their legal annihilation. The spectacle of Jacques de Molay, led to the stake and proclaiming innocence, became a closing act in a tragedy the order had long been scripting. The image of burned martyrs is a powerful counterweight to the archival truth of ledgers and land transfers. That contrast is the lesson of propaganda's success. Once an image anchors itself in culture, correcting it becomes a nearly impossible task. What remains is to ask, how many other institutions have used similar tactics, melding sanctity, law, and secrecy to shield economic aims? The Templars' playbook is archetypal. Manufacture credibility, shield operations legally, cultivate allies, control information, and when convenient, turn adversity into a fundraising moment. The modern eye sees echoes in corporations that sponsor charities, NGOs that lobby for tax advantage, and states that sanctify policy for profit. The mechanism endures. Having seen the tools the order used to craft its public-face texts, rites, legal forms, patronage, and visuals, the next step is to synthesize, to look beyond the mask and propose a more honest portrait. The question is not whether the Templars were wholly one thing or another. The question is how an institution can be so successful at appearing noble that its economic functions are obscured for centuries. That sleight of hand, they open with prayers, they close with decisions that read like investment directives. The Grand Master's voice is both pastoral and corporate. He speaks of salvation and of rents due from Breton manors. He quotes scripture and the terms of Fefment. For the brothers present, those were not two separate worlds. Faith justified the enterprise. The enterprise secured the mission. To be clear, many brothers believed. Plenty were sincere in their vows. Many were battlers who endured hardship in the Levant. But sincerity did not erase structure. The order institutionalized incentives. It created career ladders. Younger knights learned both horsemanship and accounting. The rhetoric of renunciation, poverty, chastity, obedience was real for much of the rank and file. For others, it functioned as the credential that opened doors. Men who brought property as membership gifts were often absorbed into management. The order's growth depended on this precise moral economic alchemy. Exchange your patrimony for spiritual capital and lifelong shelter within a powerful network. This is where the common moral framings falter. When we call the Templars corrupt, we risk moral caricature. Corruption implies transgression against openly stated norms. The Templars rarely transgressed their own rule, they adapted it. Their rule contained provisions around property, hospitality, and stewardship. It allowed for procuring lands in the name of the order, for accepting bequests, for managing rents. The genius, if you want to call it, that was in how they read and expanded those provisions. They treated legal privilege as a resource to be cultivated and as a shield to be defended. Consider the legal shell that protected them. Papal bulls placed the order under the direct authority of Rome, exempting it from episcopal taxation and local courts. That was not a clerical blunder. It was a strategic victory secured through lobbying, argumentation about spiritual efficacy, and the cultivation of fear and awe. To secular lords, an order exempt from taxes was at once useful and threatening. To the Pope, it was a tool of influence. To the Templars, it was a corporate charter. They exploited that charter in ways the early medieval legal imagination had not fully foreseen. Corporate logic shaped military choices. The Crescent to Hattin sequence has already been described: personal vendetta, catastrophic charge, institutional consequences. Yet that arc also highlights something more structural. The order could not afford to be reduced to mere defenders of soil. Their survival required a continuing narrative of need. Siege, battle, loss. Each could be turned, in dispatches and sermons, into a call for support. The Grand Masters learned this grammar quickly. Crusader defeats were not only tragedies. They were occasions to re-legitimize privileges and to solicit new endowments. This is the uncomfortable calculus. Combat sustained the brand. The brand secured financial flows. This is why recruitment matters. The Order's membership strategy, welcoming second sons, widowers with property, men who brought dowries or estates, was not incidental. It was how capital was aggregated. When a landed gentleman joined, his patrimony often passed to the Order in exchange for spiritual benefits and social security. That transfer was framed as pious, as liberating. But it had a clear, modern quality: consolidation, diversification, vertical integration. The Templars did not simply fight and farm. They owned tenants and courts, mills and bridges, the flows of local commerce. Each manor gave income. Each preceptory gave reach. The network effect is obvious in hindsight. More houses, more liquidity, more political muscle. A corporation of that scale needs instruments, standardized tests of loyalty, channels for influence, agents on the ground. The Templars supplied chaplains in parishes, offered associate memberships to lay supporters for lifetime spiritual services, and trained clerks whose scripts could be reused across Europe. This apparatus created a predictable revenue stream, and, equally important, a chorus of voices who could vouch for the order's sanctity from within the parish pulpits and market squares. In a largely illiterate society, that kind of vocal, visible endorsement is worth more than any sealed charter. It is tempting to say they gamed the piety of Europe. A more precise formulation, they translated piety into institutional capital with remarkable methodical skill. They made the spiritual claim legible to secular authorities. They turned pilgrim fear and aristocratic aspiration into depositable assets. And because ecclesiastical law still privileged sacred ends, the order had legal insulation from many forms of local accountability. The insulation, over time, became a hazard. The secrecy which had protected assets and decisions made them vulnerable to suspicion and later, to political predation when the balance of power shifted. That shift is part of the tragedy and the lesson. The mechanism that keeps an institution alive, legal privilege, secret votes, a mystique that shields donors, can also create moral blind spots. When power and property cluster, small misjudgments amplify. Leaders form echo chambers. In the Templars' case, decision-makers whose authority derived as much from financial competence as religious charisma sometimes behaved as executives more than as pastors. The result is not a comic book villainy, but a human pattern. Managerial pragmatism that disdains messy spiritual ideals when they conflict with organizational survival. What does this reconstructed portrait change for the observer? It reframes the order's fall. Jacques de Molay's final cry from the pyre becomes, in this light, an image deliberately selected by posterity to redeem a complex institution. Martyrdom is tidy, ledgers are not. Memory prefers the rhetoric of sanctity to the dull arithmetic of rents. That preference explains both the persistence of myths and the difficulty historians have in overturning them. The Templars' public image, the white mantles, the martyr narratives, was a superior product. It outlived the institution precisely because products remain longer in culture than ledgers do in archives. And yet, to end this portrait on a reductive note would be a mistake. The institution contained courage, charity, moral conviction, and yes, greed and calculation. In any large human project, those elements coexist. What matters is how incentives structure choices. When an organization is built with legal privilege and a dependence on perpetual crisis for legitimation, it will, predictably, act to reproduce that crisis or to narrate the world in ways that preserve its reason to exist. The Templars did not invent that logic, they refined it. So when the viewer asks whether the Templars were saints or sinners, the honest answer is that they were architects of a new institutional form. A religiously legitimized corporate actor whose survival strategy reshaped medieval politics and finance. In the long run, that form influenced us. The Templars were a medieval prototype of something we meet everyday: organizations that package moral claims to shield and expand economic power. Understanding them means practicing a kind of historical X-ray, seeing both the halo and the balance sheet, the prayer and the ledger together. Only then can we understand how their model migrated into institutions that followed. The next question is sharper. If we recognize the Templars as an early corporate actor, which modern institutions are repeating their choreography today? The answer will not come as a drama, but as a pattern endlessly reproducible. And if you find that unsettling, then the reconstruction has done its job. It has invited you to look at symbols and ask who profits when they are sanctified. That's the real test of historical honesty. The Templars did not vanish when the papal bull dissolved them. Their structures, legal, financial, symbolic, breathed on. Their innovations were adopted, adapted, and sometimes camouflaged into new forms. If you watch modern finance, corporate law, and political lobbying with the Templar blueprint in mind, you start to see echoes. Offshore shields, charitable fronts, private security, and managerial insulation. The legacy is not romantic. It is practical, and it is intimate in the way it touches daily life. Start small. Imagine a merchant in the 13th century who travels from Genoa to Acre. He deposits a chest of silver with a Templar house in Europe and receives a letter permitting him to draw equivalent coin in the Levant. That document solves that insistence fed into later developments. Corporations that can own property, sue, and be sued. Bodies politic that claim immunity in certain domains. Modern corporate personhood is a long chain of juristic precedents and practical necessities. The Templars are one early link. Culture absorbed the Templar image too, but it absorbed the simplified version. The white mantle became a symbol, purity paired with martial vigor. That image traveled through chronicles into chapbooks, into the pages of romantic literature, into paintings, and later into film and video games. Culture loves a clear emblem. A white cloak is easier to stitch into narrative than a ledger entry. Consequently, the Templars became more myth than institution. The myth simplified a complex corporate religious hybrid into an archetype, the secret of brotherhood guarding sacred mysteries. That archetype is powerfully useful. It can be mobilized for tourism, for national pride, for literary sale. Medieval castles are profitable because they are legible as objects of mystery. Towns rebuilt tourist itineraries around Templar lore. The flow of economic benefit reversed the original direction. A once financial enterprise became, centuries later, a commodity marketed for pleasure and identity. The irony is bitter. The financial scaffolding of the order now funds guided tours and branded souvenirs long after the original uses of those revenues were political and military. We also find the Templar pattern in how modern institutions shield certain activities behind moral claims. Charitable foundations with tax advantages, churches with extensive landholdings, non-governmental organizations with auditor-proof influence all can resemble the medieval model. The instrument is simple. Present a moral mission publicly while operating complex financial strategies privately. In this sense, the Templars are ancestor rather than anomaly. On the political level, consider how monarchs and state actors learned to manipulate corporate entities. Philip IV of France, whose actions led to the order's suppression, did not invent the technique of seizing assets and repurposing them. He simply demonstrated an essential truth. When an institution accumulates enough wealth and privilege, it becomes a tempting target. The dissolution of the Templars was, for modern readers, a lesson in statecraft. Confiscation is efficient debt relief. When the crown takes over a network's assets, the balance sheet shifts dramatically. That instinct taking institutional assets to rebalance national finances crops up repeatedly in later history. There is also a darker cultural consequence. Because the Templars' public story emphasized sanctity, their darker economic features were hidden behind piety for centuries. When accusations of heresy and secret rites eventually took hold, they were themselves seductive narratives easier to believe than the boring truth of ledgers and mortgages. Stories of idol worship and inverted rituals fed the same appetite for drama that makes conspiracy narratives today so contagious. In other words, secrecy begets stories, stories beget profit. The Templar case is an early template for that cycle. The entertainment industry has not been idle. Blockbusters and franchises have recoded the Templar image into modern myth. The white mantles morph into cloaks of cosmic significance. Chapter houses hide relics and inheritances of the world's secrets. These are profitable narratives. They turn a complex institutional history into a franchisable myth. Tourism and media capitalize on each other. A site with a Templar chapel sees more visitors. More visitors spur more media products. The loop becomes self-reinforcing. This cultural packaging matters politically. Myths naturalize assumptions. If a culture assumes that the Templars were mystic custodians of truth, it will read any powerful religious or quasi-religious organization in that light. It becomes easier to accept moral claims that hide economic motives. That cognitive shortcut believed the charisma, Ignore the balance sheet is a cognitive bias that affects decisions about policy, philanthropy, and even conflict. We see it when charitable organizations obtain extraordinary tax privileges and welcome scrutiny only slowly. We see it when companies donate to social causes and the donors highlight the donation while hiding the tax or regulatory benefits that flow back to them. The Templars offer a direct mirror for corporate branding strategies. Brand building aligning a logo with virtue predates modern marketing. The Templars polished an image. White mantles, ritual, public liturgies, and visible acts of charity that impressed observers. Those actions built goodwill. Modern corporations do the same with corporate social responsibility campaigns, cause marketing, and public philanthropy. The technique is identical in function. Offset reputational risk, cultivate trust, and justify legal advantages with moral performance. Finally, there is the legal shadow. The order's claim to legal exception answering directly to papal authority created frictions with local jurisdictions. Today we recognize similar dynamics in tax havens, special economic zones, and exemptions offered to multinational entities. Institutions that operate transnationally often seek legal forms that minimize accountability. The Templars' papal immunity anticipated modern legal arbitrage. Find jurisdictions that grant privileges and route activity through them. Regulation, when fragmented across polities, provides opportunities. The medieval church was the early provider of such privileges. Today's global financial system institutionalizes them on a different scale. None of this absolves the individual Templars who fought or died. Their bravery and suffering are not negated by the order's financial habits. The point is larger. Systems shape outcomes. The Templars' structures amplified certain behaviors and muted others. Understanding the legacy is not a moral excoriation of individual souls. It is a calibration of systems and incentives that have a history, and that history continues to bend our present. So when you see a glossy PR campaign, a charity gala, or a tax-exempt foundation, it is worth asking, who benefits and how? When a corporation appoints a philanthropic wing, is the public good the primary outcome, or is it the mortgage on reputation that unlocks a cascade of advantages? The Templars teach us to look at the machinery under the spectacle. That machinery is not medieval relic. It is the scaffolding of many modern institutions. If that feels uncomfortable, consider this final image. A medieval chapter house, arc lamps replaced by candles, a ledger cracked open, the same careful handwriting continuing across centuries. The quill is different now, it's a corporate report, but the hand that records interests, obligations, and privileges remains eerily similar. The Templars did not vanish, they changed clothes. Their lessons should not make us cynical alone, they should make us vigilant. Because once you know how a story is made, you see it everywhere and you can begin to ask the questions that matter. We began with a shocking scene, cloaks, coins, and counting in secret. Then the comforting schoolroom portrait the noble warrior monk was unstitched, piece by piece. We followed fictions into archives and found ledgers. We watched a dark core event reshape an order, and we traced the long, patient work of narrative making that turned managers into martyrs in the public mind. Now the final question stands, simple and blunt. If a powerful institution can wrap economic ambition in sanctity so convincingly that centuries of memory prefer the cloak to the cash, how many other heroes and causes around us are wearing the same costume? Think about the charities you trust, the corporations you admire, the histories you were taught. Which of them ask your devotion while hiding their balance sheet? If you stayed with this investigation, thank you. If you want more dossiers like this peeling the veneer off stories that make us comfortable, subscribe, share your thoughts below, and tell us which institution we should open next. Each signature, each view, helps bring dusty ledgers back into the light. What we call sacred deserves scrutiny. What we call inevitable should be questioned.